So, welcome to the lecture video on Chapter 2, The Chemical Context of Life. I'm going to sort of go through the PowerPoint and lecture with it as I would be doing if we were meeting face-to-face. So, Chapter 1 gives us an overview of biology, the hierarchy, the relevance from large-scale ecosystems to the molecular level. And now we're going to really start with molecules and atoms. Chapter 2 is chemistry, and the only way to learn about biology is to understand the basics, and the basics begin in chemistry. So, chemicals play an important role, right? Every single thing on the planet is made up of chemicals. They all have functions. We create proteins with them, or vitamins and minerals. Iron, right, is a mineral, right, that we need. And so every thing on the planet is made up of chemicals, more importantly, made up of elements. Now, there are certain elements in the body, this is a human body, this screen here, but certain elements that are required for living things. Some elements are sort of not don't play a role in living matter. But when you look at this table, you'll see that the most predominant element that we have in the human body is oxygen. At 65% of our body mass is oxygen, followed by carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And then you'll see things like calcium, all the way down to magnesium, and our trace elements, basically less than 0.01% of our body mass, from boron to fluorine to zinc. So there are about 25 or so essential elements for life. And 96% of our body are made up of the top four: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. So that's where we're going to spend a lot of our time talking about those atoms and those elements, and how those things are going to bond and create large scale molecules. So when we talk about any object or substance that occupies space and has mass, that is going to be matter, and everything is made up of matter. The periodic table. Do we have a periodic table? Interesting. No periodic table. There is a periodic table in your book, and there's also one, a link to one in the module. So the periodic table lists about 115 different elements that are available on Earth. Some, about 92 of them, are naturally occurring, and the other, 10 to 20 are man-made in the lab. So here are three. Sodium is one, chlorine, sodium chloride together, right? So the sodium and chlorine would be considered elements, and sodium chloride would be considered a compound or a molecule. So matter is made up of elements. The periodic table lists those elements. The elements are basically a substance that can't be broken down into anything else. So when you look at this image, you'll see sodium is an element, chlorine is an element, but sodium chloride is a combination of those two things. So sodium and chlorine are elements, but sodium chloride is not. When we talk about the periodic table, right, we're going to talk about the fact that the periodic table is arranged in a certain way. And you'll see that there are numbers from 1 all the way to 100, and depends on which one you're looking at, but 115, 119. They're arranged by what are called the protons. Now, in order to understand that, we have to sort of dive into what we're talking about. So this image here, figure 2.3, is a picture, a graphic of what's called helium, one atom or one unit of helium. Helium on the periodic table, you'll notice, is number 2. It's on the top right-hand side, and that 2 means that it has 2 protons, but that's not the whole story, right? Atoms are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons in some sort of combination. Here you can see that helium has 2 protons, 2 neutrons, and 2 electrons. The numbers on the periodic table are the number of protons. For all intents and purposes, the number of protons equals the number of electrons, unless they're bonded into a compound. The number of neutrons, though, is always going to vary, so it's not always 2, 2, and 2, or 3, 3, and 3. And we'll get to that in a minute. But so you can see here that we have the 2 protons and the 2 neutrons are the 2 particles that are found in the middle. That's called the nucleus. And then you'll see those two little negative signs, the blue negative signs. Those are the electrons, and those circle the nucleus in what are called the orbits. Um, and so here we have one orbit with two electrons in it. So you have two protons, two neutrons clumped together in the nucleus with two electrons surrounding that nucleus. So the elements are listed according to the number of protons, and underneath the atomic number, which is the number of protons, you'll see the atomic mass. The atomic mass is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. They actually have mass, they weigh something. Electrons do not. So you'll notice if you look at helium on the periodic table that its mass is 4. And that makes sense because there's 2 protons and 2 neutrons. So again, the elements in the periodic table are listed according to the number of protons. Protons and neutrons packed together in the nucleus, and the electrons orbit around the outside. Now, when we look at the periodic table, elements 6, 14, and 32, what do they have in common? Right? So in order to understand this question, we have to talk about the orbits on the atoms. And here you'll see 1. Now, each orbit can only hold so many electrons. So the inner orbit can hold 2, and subsequent orbits can hold up to 8. You always fill an orbit from the inside out. So you wouldn't have 1 and then 1, you would have 2 and 1, and then you'd build from there. So if you were to try to diagram an atom of something, you would put the protons and neutrons in the middle. You would then create electron shells on the outside and fill them up with the appropriate numbers of electrons, starting with 2 in the inner circle and then layering orbits on the outside. So if you're going to diagram an element with the atomic number of 6, you'll see that it's carbon. You'll see that it's 6 protons, 6 neutrons, atomic mass of 12, which means it has 6 electrons. So we would put the 6 protons and the 6 neutrons in the nucleus. We would surround that with 2 electron shells. The first one would have 2 electrons in it, and the second shell would have 4 electrons in it. Now, if you were to diagram 14 and 32, all of those 3 elements end up with 4 electrons in the outer shell. And so those 4 electrons in the outer shell make that are called the valence. That's the valence shell. And the valence shell, sort of the one that's on the outside, is going to determine how those atoms are going to bond. And so 6, 14, and 32, if they're in the same column on the periodic table, they will all have 4 electrons in the outer shell. So the answer here is going to be C. They have the same valence, meaning the same number of outer shell electrons, and are going to form the same number of covalent bonds. All right. Now, I said before that the number of protons dictates the atomic number of the element. So 6 is carbon, it has 6 protons. The number of neutrons can vary, and that's what this table 2.3 is showing us. It's showing us isotopes and radioactivity. And those isotopes mean that the number of neutrons varies, but it's still carbon. So you'll notice that the protons across the top are the same. But the neutrons different. In carbon-12, there's 6 protons and 6 neutrons and 6 electrons. In carbon-13, there's 6 protons, 7 neutrons, and 6 electrons. And in carbon-14, there's 6 protons, 8 neutrons, and 6 electrons. So the number of neutrons can vary. Now, why is that important? As the number of, it takes energy to hold a neutron in the nucleus. And when you get up to having an odd number of neutrons in carbon-14, for example, that is going to be an unstable nucleus. And the nucleus is going to want to fire off that extra neutron. To some extent, carbon-13 as well. Carbon-12 is stable, carbon-13 is semi-stable, carbon-14 is very unstable. And that's a radioactive isotope. And so what wants to happen is the nucleus wants to kick out that extra neutron. When it does that, there's energy given off in that expulsion of that neutron from that nucleus. So that energy can be used, right? We use isotopes for radio dating of fossils. We use isotopes for scanning for certain abnormalities in the body. For example, thyroid scans with radioactive iodine, or other types of scans that will help to enhance a structure inside the human body. We can also use isotopes, though, like plutonium and uranium, to create what are called nuclear weapons. Um, the no neutron weapons. The ability of a mass release of neutrons to cause destruction is huge, so we can create bombs with them as well. So the science and the chemistry is there, just how we choose to use it. But either way, it is an unstable nucleus that wants to get rid of its extra neutron. All right, so that's a radioactive isotope. All right, here's a picture of cancerous throat tissue that's being enhanced or looked at by a radioactive isotope that would show up on an image. Interesting stuff. So when we talk about placing electrons, we can place them in the different orbitals. There's a 1 orbital. There's actually 4 second level orbitals, but each one of them, whether it's a round one, which would be an S or spherical, or one of those balloon-shaped ones, or P for pyramidal, they're each going to hold 8 electrons. So that's really all you need to take from here. So here's a little bit of a brief periodic table. You'll see that the number of shells on the outside is how the elements are arranged top to bottom. So the top row is 1 shell, the second row is 2 shells, the third row is 3 shells, all the way down. So top to bottom, it's the number of shells of electrons. Left to right, it's the number of outer shell electrons. So if you look at the hydrogen column, notice how hydrogen, lithium, and sodium all have 1 electron in the outer shell. The second column, beryllium and magnesium, each has 2 electrons in its outer shell, and you read over from there. So there is a way, that's why the periodic table sort of has a dip in the middle, right? Because we go from 1 shell to 2 shell to 3 shell, top to bottom, and number of outer shell electrons left to right. This is a very, very I guess, basic periodic table that just shows you the name, the symbol, and the drawing of the electron shells. So why do we care about all of this, right? Most elements do not exist in their elemental form. Most elements exist combined with other elements in molecules, because if the shell is not full, it is not stable. So when we look at all of these shells, from hydrogen all the way over to fluorine, every single one of those does not have a full outer shell, right? So they either have 1 and it needs 2 in the case of hydrogen, or it has 1 to 7 and it needs 8 in the case of everyone else. The exception to the rule is going to be the far right-hand column. These are called the noble gases. They all have full outer shells, and they will exist in their elemental form because they are full, and when they are full, they are stable. All the other ones are unstable, and their drive is to fill that outer shell. So for example, hydrogen is number 1. It has 1 proton and 1 electron, but that's an empty, right? That means we have 1 empty space. So 2 hydrogens come together, and they will end up sharing their electrons. It makes a hydrogen molecule, and they are going to have what's called a very simple covalent bond, right? A covalent bond is going to be when two or more atoms share 1 or more pairs of electrons. So here we have hydrogen with 1 and hydrogen with 1, and they're going to end up sharing their 1s, and so at any one time, there are 2 electrons in the outer shell of hydrogen. So that becomes a hydrogen molecule. Now this is stable. Hydrogen alone, unstable. Hydrogen as a molecule, stable. This is a brief little chart about hydrogen, oxygen, water, and another molecule called methane. It shows you how they bond together and how they share electrons. Then it gives you the electron distribution diagram, the Lewis dot, and the space filling. You don't need to memorize any of that, with the exception of the electron distribution diagram. You should understand how that works. So you want to make sure that you can do the electron distribution diagram if you are asked to in regards to the drawing of the electron shells and things like that, identifying the number of outer shell electrons, etc. All right, let's see. So this is where things start to get a little tricky, as if they're not tricky already. When we talk about bonding in a covalent way, sometimes electrons don't share equally in that bonding. It's like an unequal tug of war. And in this case, you can see this is water. It's oxygen and 2 hydrogens. And you can see that the oxygen, the big yellow arrows indicate that the oxygen is pulling something towards itself. And that something is going to be electrons. Now, what does that mean? What that means is you can see those little, I don't know what I'll call them, symbols on the top and the sides, and it looks like a weird S, an S plus and an S minus. And that basically, that lazy S means partial. So since an electron is negatively charged, when you pull electrons towards the middle, that middle part, that oxygen, is going to become a little bit more negative than the hydrogens. If you pull negativity away, the hydrogens are going to become a little more positive. And so this is what we're going to call a hydrogen bond. No, we're not going to call it that. We're going to call it a polar bond. We're creating poles. We're creating a negative and a positive pole. And so this happens when we are bonding with oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur. Those are sort of our top contenders. Nitrogen sometimes. And that's when we're going to have a polar bond, where those are so strong they're going to pull the electrons closer to them. They're still sharing them, but they're a little more selfish. All right, so this is a water molecule, which also happens to be a polar covalent bond. Still sharing, but sharing unequally. So what happens when you share unequally? Then you start to have a situation in which you can have those molecules attracting each other. So if a little bit of positive and a little bit of negative come close to each other, they're going to stick like magnets, right? So unlike non-polar bonds, where the molecules can just float around and aren't really attracted or repelled, when we're talking about polar covalent bonds, the molecules are actually going to attract each other, and they can also repel each other. If the negative ends get together, they can repel. But if one positive and one negative get together like this, we have water and ammonia, they form what's called a hydrogen bond, because usually it's between the positive hydrogen end of a polar molecule and the negative end of the polar molecule, in this case, the nitrogen end of ammonia. So we have the positive end of water slightly attracting to, so notice the hydrogen bond is a dotted line, slightly attracted to the negative end of the ammonia. It's not a straight line, it's not a solid line. Solid line indicates covalent bond. Dotted line indicates hydrogen bond. And so this is a weak interaction. However, as we're going to see in a minute when we talk about water, we are going to convey amazing, amazing properties due to these hydrogen bonds. You're going to see hydrogen bonds come up again with DNA, with protein folding. There's going to be hydrogen bonds all over the place. So understanding the polarity of water is going to be very, very important. And the polarity of polar compounds is going to be really important. So, like I just said before, which elements are most likely going to form a polar covalent bond? That's going to be number 2, because oxygen and nitrogen pull very strongly on the electrons when they share. And that's due to something called electronegativity. And there is an electronegativity chart, or a link to an electronegativity chart in the module as well. You'll see how there are some elements that have a sort of a blue and a green. Those are going to be very weak electron pullers, whereas the ones that are going to be red and orange are going to be a lot stronger at pulling electrons. And that's exactly where you're going to find nitrogen and oxygen. Another type of bond, so we have covalent, which is sharing, right, electrons to fill outer shells. Here we have 2 atoms in which we are going to transfer an electron from one to the other to fill the outer shell. When we look at these 2 elements, sodium has 1 electron in its outer shell, and chlorine has 7. Now chlorine, there's no way chlorine is going to share 7 electrons with sodium. It's going to be a lot easier energetically for our chlorine to just take that one electron off of the outer shell and stick it on its outer shell. Now, when we look to the right and you see sodium chloride, sodium has a full outer shell of 8. Chlorine has a full outer shell of 8. But chlorine now has an extra electron, which gives it that negative sign. Sodium, having lost its extra electron, now has an extra proton. So it has a positive sign. So sodium chloride is going to attract, because the negative and the positive from the two ions are going to attract each other. But that's because we've transferred an electron. Notice how they're not sharing. Notice how there's no figure 8 of electrons going around that molecule. That's called an ionic bond. Ionic bonds blend really well with polar covalent bonds because they all have charges associated with them. All right, so make sure you go back to your book and just read about this a little bit, making sure you understand the difference between polar and nonpolar covalent bonds and the difference between covalent and ionic bonds. And again, if this is difficult, ask me and we can do a studio, we can do a chat, and I can help you out. So when we're talking about forming an ionic bond, we want to have two elements that have a large difference in the number of outer shell electrons. So carbon and oxygen have 4 and 6. It doesn't make any sense. Carbon's not going to give 6 to oxygen because oxygen only needs 2, right, to fulfill that outer shell to 8. Oxygen is not going to give carbon 4 because then it will only have 2 left. It doesn't make sense mathematically or energetically. But sodium and chlorine, or lithium and fluoride, they are either they have 1 outer shell electron or they have 7. So the pull of 7 is going to just pop that 1 extra electron out of that outer shell of the lithium or the sodium. So ionic bonds are going to be formed when the two players have a very, very large difference in electronegativity, as well as the sort of the math works out in regards to transferring electrons. So the ionic bond answer here is going to be sodium chloride and lithium fluoride. Basically, if it's in column 1 and column 7, you know it's going to make a ionic bond, right? Columns 1 and 7 and 2 and 7 make ionic bonds 99% of the time. All right. So this is the end of the chapter when they start talking about molecular structure. So here we've been going over sort of simple molecules, water and ammonia and things like that. But this is a pretty complex one, this natural endorphin. You'll see the black means it's a carbon atom, the white is a hydrogen atom, and then we have nitrogen, sulfur, and oxygen atoms in the natural endorphin. Notice the square has sort of that 6-sided with a little oxygen at the bottom. And an endorphin, right, is what sort of calms the brain, calms the body. Natural endorphins bind to these endorphin receptors in the brain cell. Well, science came up with a unnatural, a man-made endorphin called morphine. Morphine is meant to calm and soothe, right, and bring down the activity of the brain. It mimics the natural endorphin structure and binds to that same receptor in the brain. It's great for what it is, but it's also really, really addictive and something that people abuse, right? Because it makes your brain feel good. But the chemistry is the chemistry. Created a molecule that mimics exactly the structure of the receptor of the brain. So this is a little bit of a question. Oh, and I don't know why there's a little transfer talk in there, but this is a beetle spraying boiling hot liquid that contains irritating chemicals as a defense mechanism. The beetle stores 2 sets of chemicals in different glands, right? Why is it not harmed with the chemicals it stores, and what causes the explosion? So here we have a chemical equation. We have a reactants on one side, some sort of reaction and products on the other. So we have 2 things on the left that rearrange to make something new on the right. So here, the beetle would have 2 chemicals in 2 different locations, but when they get together, they cause a chemical reaction, which creates heat, and the resulting chemical is an irritant, where the 2 chemicals beforehand are not. So chemicals in and of themselves have different properties depending on whether they're in atomic form or molecular form. So, so that's important to understand that a molecule or an element can have one set of characteristics, but when it combines with another, it will create a compound or another set of substances with completely different characteristics. So that's always important to understand. All right, so the end of the chapter is going to now talk about water, and we're going to go back to revisiting those hydrogen bonds, right? So hydrogen bonds here are going to be the attraction between the opposite ends of polar molecules. Now here we have 5 water molecules. You can tell by the red, which is oxygen, and the 2 whites, which is hydrogen. And because it's a polar covalent bond, the oxygen is pulling a little more strongly on the electron than the hydrogen can. And so that means that each oxygen end of water is a little bit negative, right? That lazy S again, a little negative, and then each hydrogen end is a little positive. Well, when we have positives and negatives in any kind of situation, they're going to attract each other. So you'll see the hydrogen bonds between one hydrogen and one oxygen to create water. Now, why is this important? The polarity of water makes it a really unique substance. It can exist as a solid and liquid and a gas on Earth, which in regular climate, which for most other substances, that's not true, right? You don't walk around seeing, solid, liquid, and gas oxygen. It doesn't exist, right? You have to go really, really high, really, really low temperature to get frozen oxygen. I don't even know if it's possible. So we're going to discuss 4 properties of water that they have as a result of this hydrogen bonding, as a result of being polar covalent. One of them is something that we don't even think about, the ability of plants to move water from the ground up the trunk or up the stem. And this is something that we're so used to, right? We water our flowers at the bottom and the water goes up the tree and out. And that is called, well, they're probably saying the water song, transpiration, evaporation, right? So there's a whole song about it, but we don't question it, but how is it that water goes up against gravity, right? That seems to be, if you really think about it, it seems like something that shouldn't be able to happen. So how does this happen? Evaporation occurs at the top of the tree out of the leaves, and when water evaporates, it is hydrogen bonded to the water next to it. So you can see on the right-hand side, those water molecules with the dots, and they're also hydrogen bonded to the walls of the water conducting cells of the plant. So actually, as one water pulls up and out of the tree, it actually pulls a chain of water molecules up the entire stem from the root. So that's called cohesion and adhesion. Cohesion is when the water molecules stick to each other. Adhesion is when the water molecules stick to the side or stick to another substance. So it's almost as though one pulls and they all climb up the tree. It's kind of an interesting thing. This little guy, this little spider guy, is standing on the water surface, almost like we would stand if we stood on a mattress, right? We push into the mattress, but our feet doesn't go through the mattress. It's called surface tension. Because water molecules cling to each other and because they attract each other, they make what's called surface tension, right? It's the measure of how difficult it is to break the surface of the water. Right? So he's not getting wet. He's actually standing on the water and walking across it and doesn't actually get wet. They don't exert enough force to break that surface tension. Here's an interesting little image. It's 40 miles basically from Los Angeles to Riverside. And at any one time, Riverside is 20 degrees and Palm Springs at 80 miles is almost 30 to 35 degrees hotter than Los Angeles. And this is because of the water. Water has the unique ability to moderate temperature. Because of the hydrogen bonding, it's very slow to heat up and very slow to cool down. Because as water moves, it breaks and reforms those hydrogen bonds, right? Because it's a liquid. And every time a hydrogen bond breaks, right, it absorbs some heat. Every time a hydrogen bond forms, it releases heat. So think about it. as things cool down, they start to slow down. As they start to slow down, they start to form tighter, more bonds. So hot water is cooling. As it cools, it forms a lot of hydrogen bonds, but those bonds release heat. So it's almost like it's cooling down and then it heats up when the bonds form. Cooling down, it takes a long time to cool, and the opposite is true. It takes a long time to heat up. So any of the temperatures around the water are going to be lower than temperatures away from the water because of water's ability to pull in a lot of specific heat. Which, from a a natural perspective, you're like, well, why is this a big deal, right? Our bodies, we want to maintain a internal body temperature of 37 degrees centigrade or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And being that we're mostly water, our body will moderate that temperature, right? We won't get a huge spike or a huge dip in body temperature. So it's a moderate. Ponds don't freeze solid, right? They don't boil to a high heat, right? Things sort of moderate. So from an ecological and environmental perspective, the ability for water to absorb heat and release heat slowly is super important. So water has an unusually high specific heat, meaning it can hold a lot of heat. And this is directly related to what? Right? A, at its boiling point, water changes from liquid to vapor. B, more heat is required to raise the temperature of water. C, ice floats in liquid water. D, salt water freezes at a lower temperature. And E, floating ice insulates body of water. What do we think? Hopefully you're saying letter B, right? More heat is required to raise the temperature of water because the water will absorb a lot of that specific heat. So the answer here is B. Here we have a cute little polar bear. Look at this guy. The last of our unique properties of water is the ability of ice to be less dense than water. Ice floats on water, we know this. But that's not the case normally with the solid and liquid forms of a lot of chemicals. Most solid forms of something are going to be more dense and therefore sink in the liquid form. Ice is not that way. When things slow down, when they get cooler, they slow down. As water starts to cool, it starts to slow down. When it starts to slow down, it starts to form a lattice and a more solid structure in terms of those hydrogen bonds. So in the top circle, you can see the stable hydrogen bonds in ice. When they're stable, though, what you'll notice is that they're pulled farther away because, remember, they can attract each other, but they also repel each other. So when the repulsion and the attraction is at its perfect stability, that's when we get to ice. Now, you'll notice how it's spread out, which means it's less dense. See, the blue circle is very dense, more water molecules in the circle. If ice is less dense, if it's less dense, it's going to float. And that's why ice floats on water, because when water freezes into ice, the hydrogen bonds become stable. When they become stable, they spread out, right? And so we have ice floating on liquid water. And this is super important. We want ice to form on the top of a pond, so what's at the bottom of the pond can stay alive, right, through the winter. Water. Oh, this is actually our fourth one now. I apologize. Water is a versatile solvent because of its ability to have positive and negative ends to the molecule. The charges of both of those mix well with covalent materials like sugar and also ionic materials like salt. Anything that's charged mixes really well with water. So it is a versatile solvent, readily forms solutions with a variety of other covalently bonded polar and with the charge ions of ionic. Very exciting. So if we're going to recap, water is cohesive, meaning it attracts to itself. Water is adhesive with a lot of things, meaning those molecules will attract to the inside of trees, for example. It helps to moderate temperature, meaning it will hold a lot of heat, release heat slowly. The solid is less dense, so ice is less dense than water because of when it gets super cold, it spreads out. And then it's a versatile solvent. The charge associated with the water molecules allows it to be attracted to the charges of other molecules as well. The last thing that's part of this chapter is pH. pH is really important. Actually, it's going to be part of the lab that you're going to do this week. pH means the potential hydrogen in a solution, but basically means the amount of acid or the amount of base in a solution. And this is important because organisms and other environments are specific for pHs. For example, if you look at this table, number 2, it says gastric juice. Gastric juice is your stomach acid. Stomach acid needs to be at a pH of 2-ish for the stomach to be able to digest. If you look up at number 7, it says human blood and tears. Now, human blood is somewhere around 7.5. We wouldn't want human blood to be a 2. We wouldn't want our gastric juice to be a 7. Each environment is suited to be a certain pH. What else you'll notice is that above 8, not a lot of things live, right? Basic is not necessarily something that is regularly found in living systems. Most of the pH is going to hover somewhere between 5 and 8 for living things, with a few exceptions, right? Inside of the stomach, etc. But for the most part, it's going to be kind of a neutral pH. And the pH represents or is a measure of the hydrogen ion concentration in a solution. The more ions, the lower the pH. The fewer ions, the higher the pH. The lower the pH, the more acidic it is, right? And the higher the pH, the more basic it is. And so we want to sort of make sure that you understand what pH is, and that lab's really going to help with that, as well as understand that environments depend on pH. Our digestive enzymes will not work above a 3, above a 2 or a 3. And that's why we get an upset stomach, right? It can be too acidic, it can be too basic, and digestion isn't going to happen. So understanding the pH scale, important. This is a real life example. So here we have an airplane flying by. The airplane generates carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide enters the ocean and mixes with the water molecules. When it does that, it makes carbonate. In the second one, you'll see the carbonate is going to dissociate into hydrogen plus and a carbonate ion as a minus. So that, when you have a lot of H plus in solution, right, increasing hydrogen ion concentration, the pH starts to go down. So now we have hydrogen ions, we have a acidic environment. It's going to mix with and create these carbonates, and then that is going to cause calcium to leach out of the coral. So if you follow the arrows, right, hydrogen or carbonic acid is going to be formed, and it is going to cause the calcium to be pulled out of solution. So it's a real life example of what happens when the pH in an environment is off. And this is a direct result, or in some ways, a direct result of an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So the increase in the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is tied to an increase in acidity at the coral reefs. And from there, the increase in acidity causes calcium to leach out of the coral, and the coral can die. And so this is an interesting thing. So read about this, look into it, right? The acidification of oceans and what that's doing to the corals, because it is a direct relation to the pH that we're learning about in this chapter. So again, scientists are concerned about the increased concentrations of carbon dioxide, and why does it threaten the organisms, right? Because we're going to create we're going to raise the pH of the seawater, and that is going to cause the calcium to be pulled out of the corals. All right, so this is the end of chapter 2 on chemistry, and it's a long one, so hopefully you got something out of it. If you need to go back and listen to a couple of sections, go right ahead. If you have any questions, please give me a call. Email, inbox, reach out.